What's up, friends? Today we are going to be installing and setting up an extremely cool e-skate accessory, and that is the DaVega X. Alright, we're going to go ahead and get started with a quick unboxing, and I'll show you guys everything that comes in the box. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start unboxing this. Shouldn't take too long, but there's a lot of small things in here, so we'll see. This box was packaged inside of something else, and it arrived undamaged, which is always good, especially when it's shipping from a faraway country, like it was for this package. So one of the first things you'll see in here is the actual cable that you're going to use to connect the DaVega to your VESC. Now, this cable is basically just a 4-pin ribbon cable, but it's super nice and flexible, and I think it'll be really easy to route. It comes in 2 lengths, and I opted for the longer one since my setup requires me to go all the way from the front of the board to the very back, and it's a pretty large deck. Floating around in here, I've got 2 extra screen protectors that Jan was lovely and kind enough to provide to me in case one of the other ones broke. Next thing we've got is a package of gummy bears, and this is something that some other companies do too. Just include a little bit of candy to supplement your work, and I think that's super fun. Alright, so the rest of the stuff in here is packaged pretty tightly. In this small bag, we've got 3 buttons, which are all going to be used on the DaVega, and we'll attach those all later in the video. Also in there, we have a pretty neat 3D printed tool that comes with the buttons in order to attach them easily. Next up, we've got an angled base plate, and this is one of the 2 base plate options that you can get with the DaVega, either angled or flat, and I probably will end up using the angled one, but we'll have to see. Also in here, I've got the second base plate option, which is the flat one, and this one just goes directly on top of the board and makes the DaVega sit flat against the deck. Not sure if we'll opt for that on my mountain board, but we will have to see. Also in here, we've got a pretty cool sticker and a small business card with a QR code to the assembly instructions. And if you scan this QR code, it'll take you directly to his page. Those assembly instructions are actually pretty great, so if you find my guide confusing or too long or whatever, you can go ahead and watch those, but I think it's interesting to see it all together like I'll be doing. In this next bag, we have the actual DaVega itself, and there it is, looking incredible in its green finish that I selected. And we're actually going to have to take this apart a little bit later to put the screen protector in and make sure it's all set up properly. Next thing here is a couple of rubber pads that you can put underneath the actual DaVega, in between the DaVega and the base plate. And I will be utilizing one of these to make sure that it keeps all the water out of my setup. And Jan was nice enough to send an extra one in here so I could try out 2 different cutouts. Another thing you can order from the DaVega website is an X plate. These are often known as anti-sink plates or X things. And these are just used to prevent your screws from sinking into your deck. So this one right here is a really nice titanium colored aluminum bracket. And unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to use this on my mountain board since my enclosure is over the rear base plate, but I'll definitely find a use for it on a different board. Next, we got some screws that we'll need to attach it all together, as well as connectors for what looks like both the VESC 6 and the VESC 4 versions of the hardware / firmware setup. Next, we've got what looks like a full hex hardware kit that you could use to mount this to your board. I assume that these countersinks perfectly match up with the ones in the base plate. I will probably have to use these since my current bolts on my board are all flat pan heads. The final thing in here is actually really important. It is a small roll of rubbery adhesive, like gasket and this is used to attach the screen protector onto the housing of the DaVega. And that's actually the first step that I'll be showing you in this next part. So right now we're going to go ahead and start assembling the DaVega, and I'll take you through each step, describe it all, and make sure you guys get it installed properly. So let's go ahead and get started with the assembly. Right before we go into the assembly, I just wanted to let you know, I did reach out to Jan before making this video, and I said, I'm going to make a review on the DaVega X. Are there any things that you would like to see specifically highlighted, or is there anything that's not covered super well yet? And I'll show you guys what those things are later in the video, but he kindly offered to give me a couple extra things with my order. One of those was the extra rubber gaskets in here to try different cutouts. The other is that I got both the angled base plate and the flat one. Now, you don't actually need both of these in your setup, but he wanted to make sure that I was able to show you guys all the options that the DaVega had, whether that be mounting at an angle for like a mountain board or flat like on a normal board. He also included the rear X bracket, which was very kind of him, and I'll definitely use this on another board because it looks really nice and the finish just looks super sleek. So make sure I use that. And then it looks like normally you're supposed to have an acrylic screen protector and a glass screen protector that come with it by default, but it looks like I just have two acrylics here, which is perfectly fine because I was going to use acrylic anyway. So anyways, thanks a lot to Jan for the extra products, and it's time to get started with the assembly. All right, so like I mentioned, this section of the video is actually to show you how to assemble the DaVega, which only applies if you have the kit. And then the next section of the video will go into how it's installed on the deck. And finally, we'll go into setup with the VESC and how all of that works. So like I mentioned, you can buy this as a kit like I have here and assemble it all yourself, or you can buy it fully assembled from Jan, and I think there's a little bit of a price difference there. So let's go ahead and cover the steps for the assembly of the actual DaVega module itself. So our first step is that we need to install the gasket around the actual screen and put in the screen protector, and that is this little bit, as well as one of our screen protectors. Next, we will need to install the buttons, and then we will go ahead and install the electronics board and plug it in properly. And finally, we will plug in the cable and run that on the deck. There's two things that you're probably going to want for this install. One of those is a set of small tweezers, and the other is a set of Allen keys. Now, these tweezers aren't super necessary for the install. You can do it with your fingers, but they definitely make it a little bit easier. All right, so this first section is for installing the actual gasket onto the housing and getting it ready for the screen protector. To do that, we're going to have to actually take out the board in here because it delivers with it assembled in order to protect the components. So go ahead and unscrew the 4 screws that hold it in. And carefully remove it. These do have spacers in there too, so you want to make sure that you don't lose those when you take it out. You might be able to see them. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 black spacers that go between the 2 PCBs. The front one has the screen on it, which you can see here, and this has a screen protector on it that you'll want to take off before installing the permanent screen protector. Now, I did just find out that the glass screen protector is actually in the housing already, and it's right here. So he did give me all 3. I just didn't know that it was already in there. So we'll go ahead and set this glass one aside because I'm going to be using an acrylic one. Anyways, we now have the actual case here for the housing, And we're going to be going and installing the gasket into it. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get into this assembly step. Now, you're going to go ahead and take out your rubber gasket material. And what you're going to do is peel off a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and start in the corner over here and work our way around. So what you want to do is take the adhesive and line it up with the edge. I'll show you this closer in just a second. What I mean by aligning with the edge is you're going to make the end of the gasket line up with this vertical edge here, and you'll find out why when we make our way the rest of the way around. So you're just going to use your tweezers or your fingers and carefully work the adhesive around the outside. The corners can be a little bit tricky, so make sure you take your time. All right, so we're at the very end corner here. Now what we're gonna do is we'll just go ahead and snip it a little bit long, and we'll lay it in there. Nice and neatly. Now you can see we've got the gasket going all the way around the outside of the inner cutout on the housing. All right, that concludes the first step. We'll go ahead and move on to the next step. So you might think our next step would be to actually put the screen protector on, but what we're gonna do next is install the buttons. And the reason we're doing this is because when you install these buttons, it's pretty easy to scratch the screen protector. So we're gonna go ahead and do these now. Before installing the buttons, we'll just go ahead and take them out here. You're going to want to put these rubber O-rings onto the actual threads. In order to do that, what you're going to do is unscrew the nut, not drop it. You're going to unscrew the nut, take it off, and then we will go ahead and slide the rubber O-ring over the connector. And then you can use your fingers and press it up onto the actual threads. Your goal is to get it all the way up to the edge so that you can make a watertight seal between the button and the housing. Now we're just going to do that 2 more times. Now, all the gaskets are installed on the buttons, and one thing to note, these buttons are all the same, so you don't have to worry about which one goes where, but the important thing is that you get all the O-rings onto them. Now, our next step is to actually put them on the case. And to do that, we're just gonna go ahead and insert them in one at a time. Slide the nut on, And we'll just go ahead and finger tighten it down. And it will just sit there for the time being. And we'll do that 2 more times. So one thing to note here is if you look at the board, it goes in this direction. Now, there are connectors on here, and these connectors have an orientation to them. So you can see the little cutout at the bottom. That is actually where the top of the connector goes with its little latching mechanism. So we're going to want the latching mechanism to be pointing downwards when we install the buttons in order for the most seamless attachment experience. We'll go ahead and make sure all of the buttons are oriented such that the latching mechanism is facing downwards towards the screen area of the case. And you might have to loosen the nut a little bit on it to make sure. And as you can see, all 3 of them are facing downwards. So now what we'll do is use the pretty neat tool that Jan provides in the kit, which is this little 3D printed piece. And we'll just stick it right over and tighten the nuts down. Now you should tighten these just till they're snug, not till they're over tight. But one thing to know is that you should end with the little tab of the tool facing up. And the reason for that is because it orients the nut so that the bottom face of it doesn't collide with the screen protector. So we'll go ahead and do that for the next 2. You can see that all of these are now oriented pretty much vertically, and that the flat spot on the nuts is facing in the same direction as the screen protector. And that will bring us over to our next step. Our next step is to install the screen protector. And now is the time where you decide if you want to use the glass screen protector or the acrylic one. Both of them have their advantages and disadvantages. For the glass one, its major advantage is that it's super clear and it's very scratch resistant. However, it's not so good against impacts and rocks that might come up and hit it. So if you crack this from a rock off-road, you're pretty much gonna have to disassemble your whole DaVega and put in a new screen protector. For the acrylic, it's super impact resistant and it's probably shatter resistant, but it scratches easily, so when you're cleaning it off, you'll want to make sure that you're careful and either use compressed air or use a super soft brush. For me, I'll be installing this on my mountain board, so I'm going to go ahead and pick the acrylic screen protector because I know I'm going to be jumping around a lot and rocks will probably get up onto the top of my deck. So we'll go ahead and continue with the acrylic screen protector. The actual installation of the screen protector is pretty easy, but before we do that, we're going to have to remove the backing on the rubber gasket. So we're just going to go ahead and grab it with the tweezers. And peel it away. Now that I've peeled that away, I'm going to go back into the corners and press down the adhesive a little bit more just to make sure that it is flat. Next, we have to go ahead and take one of the protective coatings off of the acrylic. Actually, we have to do both sides since one side will be on the inside. It'll be super inaccessible as soon as we put this in. There's one, and there's the other. So we're gonna go ahead and look at the screen protector. There's actually a shape to it, and the longer end of the shape, it goes towards the longer end of the enclosure, and the shorter end goes towards the buttons. So we'll go ahead and slide this in carefully, and drop it in, and make sure that all the sides are pressed down firmly. All right, now we've got the screen protector installed. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next step, which is installing the electronics into the enclosure. All right, so it's time to actually install the electronics into the housing. This step seems like it might be difficult, but it's actually quite easy. So what you're gonna do is first take off the protector that is on the front of the LCD screen. I've already done that. And then what you're gonna do is make sure your acrylic is clean, and then just slide it in carefully and let it drop right into place. Now what you'll do is make sure your spacers are all in there, and screw in a star pattern, so crisscross, and slowly tighten it all down. Now you shouldn't ever have to do this, but there is a USB port on the actual DaVega itself, and it is not accessible once this is all screwed in. So if you got an old DaVega from somebody and you need to upgrade your firmware from version 3 to version 4, you'll probably want to do that before you screw this all in. But for me, I'm on a good version of firmware, and any firmware within the 4.0 system you can update over your Wi-Fi directly onto the device, which is super neat. Now, there is actually a new version of the DaVega hardware coming out, which is version 1.2. I'm not sure what the release date is yet, but I'll leave a link to the actual forum thread about that down below, and you guys can check that out for yourself. But for right now, my firmware is on a good version, and I'll show how to actually update it later when we get into the interface of the DaVega itself. So it's important not to over tighten this, but make sure that all of your bolts are snug. All the threads in here are in aluminum and the screws are steel, so you definitely don't want to over tighten these, which could either crush the display if you tighten them too much, or strip out the threads. Now, looking at the display, and it looks like there's no air gap at all, and it feels like these are nice and snug, so I think I'm going to leave it there and say that we're good. Now, the one thing about acrylic is that it is kind of a dust magnet, so hopefully it won't attract too much dust when we're out on the road, but definitely would rather have it be a little dusty than have it be cracked. So there you go, screen's installed, and it is looking mighty fine. There you go. Next thing we need to do is just plug in these connectors, and I'm just going to use the tweezers because it's harder to reach for me right now. And these should just go directly to the port that they're right next to. So for this one, we're just going to plug it right into the nearest one, just like that. Middle one will go down to the next one. Now, obviously you're not gonna have to do any of this if you buy the kit pre-assembled, but I wanted to save a couple dollars and that'll be fun to show you guys how it all goes together. All right, now we got all the buttons plugged in, and this last port here is for the connector that goes back to the VESC, and that is on the end of this cable. So we're gonna wait until we are actually installing it to plug that in. Actually, wait, no, we'll just plug it in now. Just go ahead and plug this right in. There you go. Now we've got all 4 cables installed. I'm not sure how this is exactly supposed to run in the enclosure, but I will check that out a little bit later and we'll have to see. But that's pretty much all the electronics installed. It's, again, pretty simple. Only takes a couple minutes, and we'll go ahead and move on from here. Before we go ahead and put this onto my board permanently, I just wanted to show you guys what it would look like sitting on a flat deck. I'm not sure that I would necessarily put it on this specific one because this is a drop-through deck, but if you wanted to, you could. And with installations like this, you can just put the cable straight down and it'll go right through the back of the truck and you can run it into your enclosure. Go ahead and set it on another one of my boards so you guys can see what it looks like. Oh, and I almost forgot, here's what it would look like with the angled base plate. And this on a flat board is one of the situations where you might want to use the angled base plate in this orientation. And you could have it sloped just like that. So in this case, it would give you a little bit more of an angle up towards you, and it'd be a little bit easier to see. Right here, we've got the loaded omakase, which is a deck that I'll be using for my shortboard build soon. I don't think I've seen any mount a DaVega on here before, but if you have the interest in doing it, this is what it would look like. I have a feeling that it might get in the way of foot placement on certain setups, depending on how far forwards you put your foot. And I definitely won't be doing this, but this is how it would look. I think it actually looks pretty decent. But again, with this one, you probably would want the angled base plate. And you would definitely be looking at drilling a hole through the deck and running your wire into your enclosure underneath. Now, for our actual install, we're going to be taking off this X mount on here, taking out the screws here, installing a base plate as well as the DaVega in this space. And I'm looking at it right now and thinking of the angle that I'd probably be looking at the DaVega. I'm probably going to want to use the angled base plate, but in the other orientation. So for me, I would put the base plate like this so that the DaVega isn't a better line to my eyes. And in just a second here, we'll take off the stuff that's on here right now and get it installed. Alrighty, so we've gotten the truck taken off and I cleaned up a little bit of the dirt that was on here, and now comes the decision to make the choice of if I want to have it flat like this or if I want to use the angled base plate and have it angled up towards me like that. I think I'm going to go ahead and use this angled one. The Harrow deck, I believe, has 30-degree angled tips here, and I think this is just going to work out a lot better for me. All you have to do for this step is take the 4 bolts with the countersink and install them into my truck. There's a couple mounting patterns to allow for different kinds of decks and different kinds of setups. So for me, I think I'm going to go ahead and put it in the middle mounting spot here, and I think that'll provide me a good amount of space for my foot and the front of the deck. So these screws are actually quite long. They're sticking about longer, and I mostly just don't want. All right, there we go. The base plate is now installed. Our next step is to actually install the DaVega onto the base plate. But before we do that, I want to mention one quick thing. It looks like to me that the plan for running the wire inside the DaVega is to just stick it here. And while that's probably perfectly fine, it is kind of on top of these solder joints and I jump a lot. So I'm going to take this piece of cardboard that was actually included in the kit with the other screen protectors, and I'll just stick it in here, and that'll provide a nice layer of insulation between the wires and the solder joints. And then on top of that, we will stick this black rubber gasket, and that will seal off our housing from the elements and from dirt. However, we're going to make a small cutout on the bottom here to allow the wire to come out. As you can see, I've gone ahead and made that small cutout on the bottom of the rubber gasket here. And now all we have to do is put the gasket on and install the base plate onto the housing. So we're going to need 4 screws for this, and we are going to have to use the 4 longer screws that were included in the bag with the actual gaskets, because the default ones are not long enough. I would recommend probably Loctiting these if you're going to be riding a lot. Actually, I'd probably recommend Loctiting them anyway. I'm not going to yet because I might have to take it off again to install something else, but I would recommend Loctiting these bolts so that it doesn't come rattling loose when you're on the trail. I don't think it will be a problem since there's a rubber gasket in there that helps a lot with bolts not backing out, but you can't be too careful and it definitely can't hurt. One thing to remember is that these threads are, again, in aluminum, so you need to be careful when you're threading this in and make sure that you don't strip the actual threads in the base plate. Since the DaVega is now installed on the board, as you might guess, our next step is to take care of this cable that has to go all the way back to the ESC enclosure. So that will be our next step. And for this step, we're going to be routing it through the bindings underneath the middle enclosure, over the back binding, and into the enclosure at the back. Now you might think this is a little bit risky, but I think it'll be perfectly fine, and it's just a temporary solution until I get my new grip tape and I'm able to route a small channel that goes underneath the middle of the binding. All right, so as you can probably see, my board is in a very disassembled state right now. I took off my battery enclosure in the center in order to install a new shock pad that has the wire routing channel for the DaVega on this side. So that's all ready to go. And then I also went ahead and put on this orange mesh sleeving for looks. And the reason I picked orange is because this build is themed around one of the My Hero Academia characters named Bakugo, and orange is part of his kit, so I wanted to work that into this build. Now, this mesh size is a 1/4 inch, and it pretty much perfectly fits on the DaVega wire itself, and it's pretty easy to get on there. Only took a couple minutes. So if you want to put some mesh on your DaVega cable like mine, go ahead and get 1/4 inch mesh. Now, one thing to remember here while we install this is that the bindings do move. You can open them up bigger and you can close them down smaller, so I have to leave enough extra slack on the cable for when I make binding adjustments. And I pretty much guessed on the length of the mesh and I think I got it right, but for the cable we're going to make sure we leave just the right amount of slack in there. I'm really glad that I got the longer cable, because if I got the shorter one, I definitely would not be able to use this method of routing. So this one is about my side over here. And that one's about my side there. So go ahead and say that that's probably enough cable to go after there. Alright, so we're almost done here, and right now I'm just working the cable into the mesh sleeving. And as soon as I'm done with this, then we'll go ahead and run it alongside the power wires, which I'm also going to be putting in some mesh sleeving. Alright, so now we're on one of the last steps of this build. I've got my wires run through my binding and into my enclosure. And now our task is to actually wire this into the VESC. Now, on this build, I have a Foxbox Unity temporarily. I think I'll be switching this to a DV6 soon, but I have a Unity, and for that, we're going to need to reach into our little bag and pull out the smaller of the two connectors. The bigger one is too big to fit in the slot on the Unity, so we're using the smaller one. Next, we also will need to pull up the schematic for the Unity to figure out what the pinout is for this connector, because it's super important that you plug the DaVega into the correct pin. Now, in order to figure out which wire is which on this connector, or on the cable, you're going to need to trace it back to the actual DaVega output, and I took a picture of mine, plugged it in, and I'm going to put it here on the screen so you guys can see what I'm also looking at. And all we're going to do is we're going to follow that pinout on the DaVega and match it up with the pinout on this Unity connector. And I'll show you guys what that looks like as soon as I've plugged it all in. Okay, so I've got it all plugged in, and it was super easy. For the Unity, it's just 3.3 volts, ground, skip one, and then TX, and then RX. So if you look at the actual connectors, there's a little tab on them that needs to click into this receptacle, and you'll feel and hear a small audible click. Once you've got it clicked in, you'll know that it is in place, and then you can go ahead and install it right into the ESC by pressing firmly and making sure it's completely seated. After that, you're pretty much ready to go, and make sure that you double check before plugging it in to make sure that you're using the 3.3 volts and not the 5 volts, especially on version 1.1 hardware. With that, we are done assembling and installing the DaVega onto my mountain board. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Took a lot of time to film it and put it all together. So I hope you really found it useful. And if you did, go ahead and hit that like and get subscribed to stay tuned for the next part of this video, where I go into the features and the setup of the DaVega itself to make it run the best way possible for your board. At the end of that video, I'll also give you guys some of my impressions on what it's like to ride with the DaVega, how I found it useful, and more footage of just how awesome it looks on the board. Anyways, I really appreciate you guys taking your time and watching. I've been having a decent amount of gain on the channel lately, and that makes me really happy. It means that people enjoy my work and that I'm spreading a good message for you guys on your boards. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed. Stay safe, keep on riding, and peace out.